Hi everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Brainstorm here on the 4 News Now YouTube channel. I'm meteorologist Matt Gray. We have some interesting stuff for you today, some climate-related shenanigans to go over here. And this is going to be a little outside of our little inland northwest bubble that we talk about so much. We're going to kind of go beyond and take a more of a national perspective because we're talking about sea level rise. There was a big report that came out from NOAA, which is the environmental agency of the U.S. government. They run the National Weather Service, lots of scientific research. So if you hear me say NOAA, that's basically the United States government scientists folks. So let's dig in here. So this report came out, I believe it was either on Valentine's Day or the day after, and boy, some pretty hard-hitting conclusions here. So this is the latest findings from the sea level report. On average, the United States is going to see as much sea level rise by the year 2050, which, if you think about it, here in 2022, not all that far away. We'll see as much sea level rise by 2050 as we saw during the entirety of the last 100 years. And the really important thing on the bottom here of this graphic, sea level rise leads to increased coastal flooding even in the absence of rain or storms. This is actually becoming quite a big issue where I'm from in Florida. The folks down in Miami, they actually get a lot of high tide flooding now. In fact, it's several days per year that whole neighborhoods end up flooding, and it'll be a beautiful sunny day, but it just happens to be a higher than kind of the highest high tides that they get. They call them the king tides. And well, now that the sea level is getting significantly higher, and now more and more places are flooding. Now the other part of that is, of course, there's been a lot of urban development in the Miami area in the last 30 years. So all these things factor in together, but the higher the sea level is, the more likely you are to have flooding in some of our neighbors and coastal communities. That's even the case over on the west coast and the coast of the Pacific Northwest, but it's not as big of an issue yet, and I'll go into that in just a minute. But so here is kind of the idea where basically you have all the climate computer models that simulate global warming and how that would impact sea level rise and the processes that cause those. And you notice here that in the green lines what's called the observed trend. So basically this is the most basic kind of forecast where we go, okay, here's how sea level has been rising. We know what that trend is. We know what that rate is. I think it's a couple of centimeters a year or something like that. So then we can project that out. We can take in we understand kind of at least kind of our minimum or kind of an average of how warm our planet's warming. And so all of those things get fed together, and that's why this report is so interesting, because it's not really talking about these higher scenarios. It's really talking about kind of a middle or a lower ground as far as sea level rise goes. And I think that's the more that's probably why it should be so concerning, because of how conservative the report is about things. After all, we really don't know until we get there kind of how the continued warming of our planet is going to affect all these different systems that have to intermingle together, and some of which we're still trying to understand how everything's connected. But let's take a look a little bit closer here. So consider this, between right about 1880 and 2020, so basically the whole 140 odd years, pretty close to it, of the existence of Spokane, for example. Global sea levels have risen about 9 to 10 inches. That's quite a bit. It's not going to mean all that much when you're just looking out at the beach, but if you consider that, for example, on the East Coast, once again, if you have a hurricane that's going to bring in say a 2-foot storm surge, now a lot of places wouldn't worry about it all that much, but guess what? Now that sea level is about 10 inches higher, now there's more places that have to worry about these things. So it really becomes kind of this problem that sneaks in the background. A lot of climate change is actually in the background, guys. It's not this kind of punch you in the face type of situation that sometimes our drought and our fire seasons end up becoming around this part of the country. But sea level rise, very sneakily happening, and sneaky in making these flooding events that are happening on the coast more common, or even making storms that pass by, they're flooding along the coastlines even more damaging than they were before. Now, what's causing all of this, right? Well, obviously it's our warming planet, but there's obviously not warming itself. That's not going to just contribute to it. It's really about melting ice, and it's about simply ocean heat content. Ocean heat content has gone up quite a bit in the last 100 years, and actually just a little bit, that water gets warmer and actually expands. So there's some sea level rise. They call that thermal expansion. So that's the red line. We're also looking at, really the vast majority of it is adding water into the ocean by melting of ice caps, by melting of glaciers. And that's a big issue here in the West. Our glaciers are disappearing very, very quickly. I want to give you a couple of examples about that. And all of that water that's being put into the ocean instead of stored up in ice, and a great water reservoir for us in the very dry parts of the western United States. So that's also an issue as well when we talk about water supply. That's a much more stable water supply. Glaciers were a more stable water supply than the yearly snowpack. So you had a bit more of as far as like irrigation and water supply during the summer months, you're a little more drought resistant with those glaciers. Now, that's not so much the case. So take a look at this. This is from a glacier in Alaska provided by NOAA in their report from pictures taken in 1941, and now look how far back it's gone in 2004. And that's just slightly warmer than average temperatures, more warm days than cool days, more melting. And as the years and the decades drag on, it makes a big difference over time. This is also a tweet from earlier in February from the Washington State DNR, where they're using basically light waves to penetrate through the snowcap and look at the glaciers on Mount Baker and a lot of other places around the Northwest, and showing that in the last 50, 60 years, those glaciers are starting to retreat. And once again, it's about more warm days than cool days on average, and slowly these things are shrinking. So, and that's happening everywhere around the world. I know a lot of times when people talk about climate change and global warming, they talk about the polar regions and how those glaciers are melting very quickly. Some of those that are attached to places like Antarctica, for example, glaciers that come off the Antarctic continent. So there's a lot going on with this. But it's all contributing to this just very slow, creeping sea level rise that is going to make things harder and harder to deal with along the coast. And most of the world's population is pretty darn close to the ocean. Us here in the inland Northwest and around the center of the country, we're kind of an outlier. Usually you're close to some large body of water, and even then, our rivers, that's where civilization builds itself, and civilization builds off of the ocean. So just keep that in mind. I'll talk about that again in a minute, but take a look at this. So one of the things that happens when these glaciers and these large areas of snow and ice melt is that the land below it's actually being compressed down. I know this is crazy to get. Just take a moment to process this, right? Well, as that ice melts, because ice is very heavy, a gallon of water weighs 8 pounds, ice is very dense. As those glaciers and those snowcaps melt, the land actually rises. Once again, it's very almost imperceptible. It's by millimeters, centimeters, really, really tiny stuff. But that rebound, or what they call glacial rebound, is actually meaning that the sea level has actually not changed that much from Alaska all the way into the Northwest. In fact, in some cases, it's actually risen a little bit. Now, look, this is not going to last forever, but you notice on the other side of the country, as you head further south, where we don't have kind of the snowy, icy climate, you'll notice that the sea level is rising quite a bit, and that goes almost everywhere around the equator regions of the world. It's really the places that have had those historic ice caps where the sea level is either staying put or is rising in those brown dots there. Everybody else in the blue is seeing rising sea levels. So something to think about. Another thing that I want you folks to think about here is that while this may not directly affect us, sea level rise in the inland Northwest, think about this for a minute. Think about what the pandemic did to kind of where people wanted to live. All of a sudden, there's a large portions of rural America, especially here in the rural West, where people all of a sudden left because of socioeconomic factors. Well, weather and climate is a big factor as well, and there's in the kind of the community that studies this, there's a lot of people that talk about climate change fueled migration. So just think about this for a minute. If you were, say, like me, what I used to be, I lived in Florida and you're along the coast, and you got a big house and it floods all the time and you have all these sorts of issues, would you consider moving if you were able? Something to think about. Not going to say it's a good or bad thing one way or the other, but just that the weather and climate and everything that goes around it does impact people's decision making as well. So maybe they want to move to a cooler place. Maybe they want to move to a place that doesn't have hurricanes. Maybe they want to move to a place that has less fire danger. Maybe they want to move to a place that they don't have to worry about their house flooding during high tide. So something to think about. We've been dragging on about this, but sea level rise is something that is just creeping around in the background and becoming a topic that's going to be more and more widely discussed as the years go on, as we continue to track the changing climate of our planet as it responds to all of us and how we interact with our world. So thank you for joining this edition of the Brainstorm. A little deep dive tonight, a little more academic. If you like what you see here, go ahead, like the 4 News Now YouTube page. We keep you updated on everything going on in the inland Northwest with news, with your weather, and sometimes we do cool sciencey stuff like this. So have a great rest of your day, your night, your week, your weekend, and we'll see you again soon.